Thomas Bennett stood at the charity gala podium, his calloused carpenter hands trembling as he adjusted the microphone. The crystal chandeliers cast shadows across his weathered face, while 300 of Chicago's elite sat in stunned silence. His borrowed suit hung loose on his thinning frame, a stark contrast against the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos surrounding him. The auction paddle in his grip bore an item number that had already caused whispers throughout the ballroom, something no one had ever dared to offer before. As the murmurs grew louder, a billionaire pharmaceutical heiress in the front row leaned forward, her cold blue eyes studying this broken man with unexpected intensity. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously, glancing between his notes and the stranger who had somehow made it onto the most exclusive guest list in the city. Thomas took a shaky breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either save his daughter's future or destroy what little dignity he had left. "Ladies and gentlemen," he whispered into the microphone, "I'm here to auction something that can't be returned." The Ritz-Carlton Chicago had never hosted an auction quite like this one. Outside, December wind whipped through the magnificent mile, rattling windows of the Crystal Ballroom, where Chicago's wealthiest gathered for their annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Inside, warmth radiated from golden chandeliers that had witnessed decades of philanthropy, each light casting dancing shadows across marble floors, polished to mirror perfection. The evening had begun like any other high society fundraiser, with champagne flutes clinking and conversations flowing in hushed, refined tones. Thomas Bennett had arrived 2 hours early, not as a guest, but as part of the maintenance crew. His usual job involved fixing broken cabinets and squeaky doors at Lincoln Elementary School, but tonight he'd volunteered for extra work, setting up tables and adjusting sound equipment. The $20 an hour would help with Emma's school supplies, and he'd hoped to slip away before the actual event began. But as he watched servers arrange elaborate centerpieces and guests begin to arrive in their finery, something shifted inside him. 3 weeks ago, Dr. Martinez had delivered news that changed everything. Terminal pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. No insurance, no savings, no safety net for 8-year-old Emma. The borrowed suit came from his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, whose late husband had been roughly Thomas's size. She'd pressed it into his hands that afternoon with tears in her eyes, understanding without words what he planned to do. The fabric smelled faintly of mothballs and old spice, carrying the ghost of a man who'd never had to choose between his own dignity and his child's future. Thomas had spent the last hour pacing the hotel's service corridors, rehearsing words that felt impossible to say aloud. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger, hollow cheeks, eyes that had seen too much loss, hands that trembled not from nervousness, but from the medication keeping his pain manageable. As guests filtered into the ballroom, Thomas recognized faces from newspaper society pages. Mayor Patricia Collins worked the room with practiced ease, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. Real estate mogul Richard Hartwell commanded attention near the bar, his booming laugh carrying across marble floors. But it was Elizabeth Morrison who caught Thomas's attention. He'd seen her photograph in Forbes magazine just last month, the 38-year-old CEO of Morrison Pharmaceuticals who'd built her father's small drug company into a billion-dollar empire. She moved through the crowd like a predator studying prey, her emerald evening gown a stark contrast to the calculating intelligence in her eyes. Thomas had researched every major donor in attendance, memorizing names and faces during sleepless nights when Emma slept soundly in the next room. He knew their net worth, their charitable giving histories, their public personas. What he didn't know was whether any of them possessed enough humanity to understand what he was about to offer. The auction paddle felt foreign in his calloused hands, its smooth surface a reminder that he didn't belong in this world of inherited wealth and casual philanthropy. But Emma belonged somewhere, and if this was the only way to secure her future, then Thomas would find the courage to see it through. The evening's program had already begun when Thomas made his decision. Children from the hospital's cancer ward had performed a heartbreaking rendition of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," their small voices carrying hope that Thomas wished he could still feel. The irony wasn't lost on him, children fighting for life while he prepared to auction away his own. But that was exactly the point. His death could have meaning if it provided for Emma's education, her dreams of becoming a doctor, her chance at the life he'd never been able to give her. Dr. Patricia Wong had finished her presentation about the hospital's new pediatric wing when Thomas approached the registration table. The volunteer, a woman in her 60s wearing pearls and perfume, looked up with practiced politeness that faltered when she saw his face. He'd filled out the auction form earlier, listing his item as "a father's final gift," but the description he'd provided was vague enough to avoid immediate rejection. Now, standing before the curious gazes of 300 of Chicago's elite, Thomas realized there was no turning back. The auctioneer, a distinguished man named Charles Whitmore, who'd been conducting charity auctions for 2 decades, had never encountered a donation quite like Thomas's. When Thomas had quietly explained his situation during the dinner break, Whitmore's professional composure had cracked for just a moment. The man had handled million-dollar art pieces and rare vintage wines, but never a dying father's desperate final act of love. After consulting with event organizers and legal advisors, they'd agreed to let Thomas speak, though nobody quite understood what they were agreeing to. Elizabeth Morrison had been only half listening to the evening's proceedings, her mind occupied with a hostile takeover attempt her company was facing from a German pharmaceutical giant. She'd attended this gala for 3 consecutive years, writing substantial checks more out of obligation than genuine charity. Her own childhood, spent in a series of foster homes after her parents died in a car crash, had left her skeptical of others' capacity for genuine kindness. Wealth had become her armor, success her validation, but neither had filled the hollow space where family should have been. But something about the man at the podium made her look up from her phone. Thomas Bennett didn't carry himself like the other speakers who'd addressed the crowd that evening. There was no polished confidence, no practiced charm. Instead, she saw something she recognized from her own mirror during the darkest moments of her youth: the desperate determination of someone with nothing left to lose. His hands shook as he adjusted the microphone, and Elizabeth found herself leaning forward, her cold blue eyes studying this broken man with unexpected intensity. The ballroom fell silent as Thomas began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the sound system. 300 faces turned toward him, some curious, others annoyed at the interruption to their carefully scheduled evening. Thomas cleared his throat, looked out over the sea of elegant strangers, and began to reveal the most intimate details of his life to people who viewed charity as a tax deduction. The auction paddle in Thomas's grip bore item number 47, a number that would haunt Elizabeth Morrison for the rest of her life. As Thomas began to explain what he was offering, the whispers started. First confused murmurs, then shocked gasps, then the kind of profound silence that only occurs when people realize they're witnessing something unprecedented. Thomas's voice grew steadier as he spoke, as if the act of finally saying the words aloud had freed him from the weight of carrying them alone. What happened next would be remembered by everyone in attendance as the moment a simple charity gala became something far more significant. Thomas Bennett, a 45-year-old carpenter from the south side of Chicago, was about to offer something that no auction house in the world had ever listed. Something that challenged every assumption about the value of a human life and the lengths a parent would go to protect their child's future. Elizabeth Morrison's manicured fingers tightened around her champagne flute as she realized she was about to witness either the most touching act of paternal love she'd ever seen, or the most desperate cry for help from a man who'd run out of options. Either way, she found herself unable to look away, her successful pharmaceutical empire suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the raw human drama unfolding just 30 feet away. The December wind continued to rattle the ballroom windows, but inside, time seemed suspended as Thomas Bennett prepared to change not only his own life, but the life of every person who would hear his story. The borrowed suit that had belonged to a dead man now carried the hopes of a dying father, and the crystal chandeliers that had witnessed decades of polite philanthropy were about to illuminate an act of love so profound that it would redefine everyone's understanding of true charity. Thomas looked out over the crowd one final time, his eyes finding Elizabeth Morrison's intense gaze, and prepared to auction the only thing he had left to give, his own heart, literally and figuratively, for the future of the daughter who meant more to him than life itself. The maintenance crew had finished their work hours ago, but Thomas Bennett remained, no longer hiding in service corridors, but standing center stage in a borrowed suit, ready to make an offer that would either save his daughter's future or mark him as the most desperate man in Chicago. The choice was no longer his to make. It belonged to the 300 strangers who would decide whether a dying carpenter's heart was worth bidding on. Elizabeth Morrison set down her champagne flute and leaned forward, her pharmaceutical empire built on saving lives suddenly seeming like preparation for this exact moment. She didn't yet understand what Thomas was offering, but she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same desperate love she'd seen in her own mother's face during those final moments before the car crash that had changed everything. For the first time in 20 years, Elizabeth Morrison felt her carefully constructed emotional armor beginning to crack. The evening that had begun as routine charity theater was about to become something far more real, far more raw, and far more transformative than anyone in the Ritz-Carlton ballroom could have imagined. Thomas Bennett's trembling hands and borrowed suit were about to challenge everything. These wealthy philanthropists thought they knew about sacrifice, love, and the true meaning of giving from the heart. Dr. Martinez's diagnosis had given Thomas 6 months to live, but tonight would prove that some gifts transcend the boundaries of life and death, reaching into the future to protect what matters most long after the giver is gone. The crystal chandeliers continued their eternal dance of light and shadow, but their illumination was about to reveal the kind of love that transforms not just individuals, but entire communities of witnesses who would never forget the night a dying carpenter taught them what real charity looked like. "My name is Thomas Bennett," he began, his voice stronger now that the moment had arrived. "I'm 45 years old and I have pancreatic cancer. The doctors tell me I have 6 months to live, maybe less." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the soft clink of someone setting down a champagne glass too quickly. Thomas continued, his eyes finding Elizabeth Morrison's face in the crowd. "I have an 8-year-old daughter named Emma. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up, just like her mother wanted to be before she died 3 years ago." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Mayor Collins leaned forward in her chair, her political instincts sensing something unprecedented unfolding. Richard Hartwell stopped mid-conversation, his businessman's mind trying to process what he was hearing. But it was Elizabeth Morrison who felt the words hit her like physical blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of the emotional armor she'd spent decades constructing. "I don't have money for Emma's future," Thomas continued, his carpenter's hands steady on the podium now. "I don't have a college fund or life insurance or any of the things a good father should leave behind. What I have is this." He touched his chest, his fingers pressing against the borrowed suit jacket. "A healthy heart, kidneys that work, a liver that could save someone's life, eyes that could help someone see their children again." The auctioneer, Charles Whitmore, shifted uncomfortably behind Thomas, unsure whether to intervene. This was territory no charity auction had ever explored, and the legal implications alone made his head spin. But something about Thomas's quiet dignity kept him silent, kept everyone silent, as if interrupting would be sacrilege. "I've already signed my organ donor card," Thomas said, pulling a worn piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "But I want to do more than just donate. I want to auction the promise of my organs to fund Emma's education. When I die, and I will die soon, my heart will save someone's life. My liver will give someone more time with their family. My kidneys will free someone from dialysis. And the money you bid tonight will give my daughter the future I can't." Dr. Patricia Wong, who had spoken earlier about the hospital's needs, found tears streaming down her cheeks. She'd seen countless acts of medical heroism, but never anything like this. A father literally auctioning his life to secure his child's future, turning his own mortality into a gift that would ripple through multiple lives. Elizabeth Morrison felt something crack inside her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced since childhood. This man was offering everything: his literal heart, his dignity, his final months of peace, for his daughter's sake. It was the kind of parental love she'd dreamed about during those lonely nights in foster care, the kind of sacrifice she'd never witnessed but had always yearned for. "I know this is unusual," Thomas said, his voice catching slightly. "I know it makes you uncomfortable, but Emma needs a chance. She's brilliant, smarter than I ever was. She reads medical journals for fun and builds anatomical models out of cardboard. She could save hundreds of lives if she gets the education she deserves. All I'm asking is that you consider whether my heart, all of my organs, might be worth investing in her future." The silence stretched on, heavy with emotion and uncertainty. Thomas stood at the podium, having laid bare his deepest vulnerability to a room full of strangers, waiting for someone to respond. The crystal chandeliers continued their dance of light, but now they illuminated something far more profound than wealth and charity. They revealed the naked love of a dying father willing to sacrifice everything for his child. Elizabeth Morrison's hands trembled as she reached for her auction paddle. Around her, other guests sat frozen, unsure how to process what they'd just heard. Some whispered to their companions, others stared in shock, but everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Thomas Bennett had just redefined the meaning of sacrifice, and his quiet courage was forcing everyone in the room to confront their own understanding of love and loss. The pharmaceutical heiress who had built her empire on extending life was about to bid on death itself, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Thomas's offer wasn't just about organs or money. It was about the continuation of love beyond the grave, about a father's determination to protect his child even after his own story ended. As Elizabeth raised her paddle, she felt the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble. This carpenter, with his borrowed suit and trembling hands, had just shown her what real wealth looked like. Not the billions in her bank account, but the willingness to give everything for someone else's future. And in that moment, she realized that Thomas Bennett was about to teach her something she'd never learned in all her years of corporate success: what it truly meant to be rich. The bidding was about to begin, but already Thomas had won something far more valuable than money. He'd won the respect and admiration of 300 people who would never forget the night they met, a man who loved his daughter more than life itself. The auction of his heart was just beginning, but the transformation of everyone who heard his story had already commenced. Thomas looked out over the crowd one more time, seeing Elizabeth Morrison's raised paddle, and knew that Emma's future was about to change forever. He'd offered his heart to strangers, and they were about to prove that sometimes the most powerful acts of charity come not from those who have everything to give, but from those who have nothing left to lose except love itself. The cancer might be killing his body, but Thomas Bennett's heart, both literally and figuratively, was about to become immortal, beating not just in another person's chest, but in the life of every person his sacrifice would touch. The borrowed suit no longer felt foreign. It had become the uniform of a hero, worn by a man whose final act would echo through generations. Elizabeth Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a prayer answered. $500,000, she said, her words carrying across the marble floors and crystal chandeliers to reach the ears of a dying carpenter who had just learned that love, when offered without reservation, can move mountains and open the hearts of billionaires. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, but Thomas heard only one thing: the sound of his daughter's future being secured by a stranger who understood that some gifts are too precious to be measured in money alone. His heart, still beating in his chest, had already begun its journey toward saving not just organ recipients, but the broken dreams of a little girl who would now have every opportunity to heal the world, one patient at a time. The bidding war that followed would make headlines, but the real victory had already been won. Thomas Bennett had taught everyone in the Ritz-Carlton ballroom what it meant to love without limits, to give without reservation, and to transform death itself into the ultimate act of life-giving love. His heart was about to stop belonging to him alone. It would soon belong to his daughter, to the stranger who would receive it, and to everyone who witnessed the night a carpenter's courage reminded them what true charity looked like. Elizabeth Morrison stood in her emerald gown, paddle raised high, ready to bid on the most precious auction item she'd ever encountered, not just a dying man's organs, but the embodiment of perfect love, offered freely by a father who had found a way to protect his child from beyond the grave. The pharmaceutical empire she'd built suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the empire of love Thomas Bennett had just revealed, one that would outlast buildings and bank accounts to live forever in the hearts of those he'd touched. As other paddles began to rise around the ballroom, Thomas Bennett smiled through his tears, knowing that Emma's future was secure and that his heart, in every sense of the word, would continue beating long after his final breath, pumping life into dreams he'd never lived to see, fulfilled but had died to make possible. The auction of a lifetime was about to reach its crescendo, but the real bidding had never been about money. It had been about love, sacrifice, and the willingness of strangers to honor a father's final gift by ensuring his daughter would have every chance to make the world a better place. Thomas Bennett's heart was about to find new life in ways he'd never imagined, beating not just in another chest, but in the pulse of hope he'd just given to everyone who heard his story. But the night's surprises weren't over. As the bidding reached $750,000, Elizabeth Morrison made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. She stood up, her emerald gown catching the light from the crystal chandeliers, and addressed not the auctioneer, but Thomas himself. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "I want to make you a different offer, not just for your organs, but for something far more precious." The room fell silent, sensing another unprecedented moment unfolding. "I want to offer Emma a home, a family. I want to adopt her, not just as a legal guardian, but as her mother. And I want you to spend your remaining months with us, as part of our family, so Emma never has to say goodbye to her father until she absolutely must." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas gripped the podium to keep from falling, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Elizabeth continued, tears streaming down her face for the first time in decades. "I grew up in foster care, Mr. Bennett. I know what it's like to be alone, to wonder if anyone will ever love you enough to choose you. You don't have to auction your heart. You've already given it to Emma, and now I'm asking you to let me help you protect it." Thomas Bennett, the carpenter who had come to auction his organs, found himself speechless. The woman who had spent her life building walls around her heart was offering to tear them all down for a stranger's daughter. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The billionaire pharmaceutical heiress who saved lives for a living was about to save the most important life of all, not with medicine or money, but with love. I'll establish a foundation in your name." Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The Thomas Bennett Foundation will help other single parents facing terminal illness. Your story, your sacrifice, your love for Emma, it will help hundreds of other children who find themselves in the same situation. Your heart will save lives in more ways than you ever imagined." The transformation in the ballroom was palpable. What had begun as a traditional charity auction had become something unprecedented, a moment when perfect strangers decided to become family, when wealth was measured not in dollars, but in depth of love, when a dying man's desperate gamble had revealed the profound capacity for goodness that existed in the most unexpected places. Thomas found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "You would do that? For Emma? For me?" Elizabeth nodded, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears she'd held back for 20 years. "Because you've shown me what I've been missing my entire life, Mr. Bennett. You've shown me what it means to love someone more than yourself." The auction that night raised more money than any charity event in Chicago's history, but the real treasure was the family that formed on the ballroom floor of the Ritz-Carlton. Thomas Bennett had come to auction his heart, and instead had found someone willing to give hers freely, no bidding required. 6 months later, Emma Bennett sat in the garden behind Elizabeth Morrison's mansion, reading a medical textbook, while her adoptive mother watched from the kitchen window. The little girl's biological father had kept his promise. His organs had saved 4 lives, and his sacrifice had created a family neither he nor Elizabeth had expected to find. The Thomas Bennett Foundation now provided scholarships for children who'd lost parents to terminal illness, funded by the most successful pharmaceutical company in the Midwest. Elizabeth had discovered that the hole in her heart, which she'd tried to fill with money and success, could only be filled with love. The kind of unconditional love Thomas had shown his daughter, and which Emma now brought into Elizabeth's previously empty mansion every single day. Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd received Thomas's heart, sent Emma letters every month describing how her new heart allowed her to continue her work as a pediatric surgeon, saving children just like Emma hoped to do someday. The recipients of Thomas's liver and kidneys had similar stories: lives extended, families reunited, dreams restored, because one man had loved his daughter enough to literally give his heart so she could have a future. Emma looked up from her textbook as Elizabeth approached with 2 glasses of lemonade, the same smile that had captured Thomas's heart now lighting up the pharmaceutical heiress's previously cold world. "Mom," Emma said, the words still new but natural on her lips. "When I become a doctor, I want to specialize in oncology. I want to find a cure for the thing that took my daddy away." Elizabeth Morrison, who had once thought her billions made her rich, now knew that true wealth came in the form of an 8-year-old girl calling her Mom, and the memory of a carpenter who'd taught her that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought. They could only be given, received, and passed forward with the kind of love that transforms not just individuals, but entire communities of people brave enough to open their hearts. The crystal chandeliers of the Ritz-Carlton had witnessed many charity galas, but none had ever generated the kind of lasting change that began the night Thomas Bennett offered his heart to strangers. His sacrifice had created ripples that would continue spreading for generations, in the lives his organs saved, in the daughter who would grow up to save others, in the billionaire who learned that love was the only currency that truly mattered, and in the hundreds of witnesses who would never forget the night they learned what real charity looked like. Thomas Bennett's heart had stopped beating in his chest, but it continued beating in Dr. Chen's, pumping life through her hands as she saved child after child in the same hospital where Emma would one day work. His love had found a way to transcend death, creating a legacy that would outlast any fortune and impact more lives than any corporate empire ever could. In the end, the carpenter who'd thought he had nothing to offer had given everything. and in giving everything, he'd received the only gift that truly mattered: the knowledge that his daughter would be loved, protected, and guided toward a future bright enough to honor the sacrifice that made it possible. The borrowed suit had been returned to Mrs. Patterson, but the love it had carried that night continued to clothe Emma in hope, Elizabeth in purpose, and everyone who heard their story in the understanding that sometimes the greatest wealth comes disguised as the greatest loss, and the biggest hearts beat in the chests of those who have the least to give, but give it anyway. The Thomas Bennett Memorial Garden, planted behind Emma's new home, bloomed with flowers that would return every spring, a living reminder that love, like life itself, finds a way to continue growing even after its source has returned to the earth. And in that garden, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, you could almost hear the echo of a carpenter's voice promising his little girl that somehow, some way he would always find a way to take care of her. A promise that had been kept in ways more beautiful and lasting than Thomas Bennett had ever dared to dream. The heart he'd auctioned that December night had found its way home after all, not in his own chest, but in the chest of every person whose life had been touched by his final gift of love. The charity gala had ended, but the charity itself, the pure, selfless love of a father for his daughter, would continue beating forever, one heartbeat at a time, in a world made better by a man who'd proven that the greatest auctions aren't about what money can buy, but about what love can give when it's offered without reservation or expectation of return. Thomas Bennett's story had come full circle, from a desperate father in a borrowed suit to an eternal presence in the lives of those he'd loved enough to die for, his heart continuing its work in ways both literal and metaphorical, pumping life into dreams, hope into despair, and love into a world that would be forever changed by one man's willingness to give everything for the future of the child who meant more to him than life itself.